So hello, everybody. Welcome.
Hello.
So back from our break. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center, and it's a pleasure to be back with you. We just started classes this week at Bard. People are back 100%. Everyone's vaccinated. It's very nice to be teaching. We taught in person all last year, but there's a much more energy and feeling around the campus this year, so it's exciting. It's good to see you guys. I hope you had a good couple-week break at the end of the summer, and welcome back. We are in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind, a book that she didn't finish, a book that she was working on at the end of her life. And it's in three parts. The first part is on thinking, second part on willing, third part on judging, just doing a little review to get us back into the spirit of this book. We're in the middle of the first book on thinking. And the first book on thinking is itself broken up into parts, chapters, if you will. And we finished last time that we met the first part on appearance. Why does a book on thinking begin with appearance? Because for Arendt, in a sense, for Arendt, appearing is what we humans do. We appear in the world, and that appearance is where we interact with others, where we share a world. It's what allows us to encounter others, and our appearance is meaningful. It actually is more meaningful than our being. So there's a traditional philosophical idea that being, the supersensual, what stands above and is not known, is higher than appearance. And yet for Arendt, there's a very important way in which we are appearing beings. We are beings that have to be in the world in a space of appearances, as she'll put it, in the human condition, and that there's a urge of all beings to appear, and thinking in many ways stands outside of that. And so in this first section, which we finished on appearing, she talks about semblances and authentic semblances. And so one of the first, really, I think, important structural understandings of her approach to this text is that the thinking ego, who I am when I think, the I am because I think in Descartes, or the transcendental ego in Kant, the thinking ego is for her a semblance. It doesn't appear. It's not real. And yet she calls it an authentic semblance. It's something that, even though it doesn't appear, and even though it may not be, is an entirely authentic semblance of the thinking activity of itself. And so in that way, we start with appearing because thinking in some ways resists that appearance. Now, as we start chapter 2 of this book on thinking, chapter 2 is called Mental Activities in a World of Appearances. Now we're going to dig deeper, and we're going to say, all right, if the world is the world of appearances, that's the world we share. Where do these mental activities, these things that don't appear, fit in, right? And she says there's 3 mental activities that are fundamental: thinking, willing, and judging, and those will be the 3 the titles or topics of the 3 books that make up this book. The first book is on thinking, which is what we're in now. the second book on willing, which we'll read next, and the third book on judging, which she never finished, and maybe we'll read some of her notes and other aspects for at the end of when we finish willing. But these three mental activities, as she calls them, are on the one hand, all, she says, autonomous. This is the beginning of section 9, which we are reading for today. They follow laws of their own. They're unconditioned, she says. Now, I mean, for those of you who've read The Human Condition, and she says that this book is in many ways the sequel to The Human Condition. The point of The Human Condition is that it doesn't talk about human nature. It talks about the human condition. And the point is that we are conditioned beings. We're conditioned by a world in which we live, a common world. And that world changes. And as it changes, we change because the condition of the world changes. The human condition is about a potential radical change in the condition of humanity brought about by the rise of modern science. And her question, and I think her argument, that there's a good chance that the radical reconditioning of the world, the change of the world through science, the world we share, is going to change what it means to be human, because we are conditioned beings. But thinking, willing, and judging, she says, are unconditioned. They don't depend on the external world. They transcend that world. Now, of course, they judge or think, and they're motivated in some sense by the world. So when I think, I'm often thinking in metaphors. I'm always thinking, Arendt says, in language or in metaphors that have their root in the world. And when I judge, I'm always judging particulars that are in the world. But thinking and judging and willing themselves are not about the world. She says they think and speculate meaningfully about the unknown and the unknowable. She cites Heraclitus, the Greek thinker, who says the mind is separate from all things, so that they can impact the world. These are thoughts, and they are inspired by the world, but they separate themselves from the world. And that's the point of this section 9 that we're starting with. And it's really divided into 3 parts, as I understand it. The first is this, claim or argument she makes about invisibility. The mental activities are invisible. They never appear. When Marguerite von Trotta made the movie Hannah Arendt a number of years ago, one of the things that was really interesting about that movie, it has a lot of there's issues we can talk about, but one of the, is they tried to make it appear that Hannah Arendt thought, and they had all these scenes of her lying on the couch, staring up, smoking her cigarette, trying to visualize thinking. What is thinking? And Arendt says you can't. Mental activities are invisible. They don't appear. They're the very opposite of what John Adams calls, being the urge to see, to be seen, to let us be seen in action, which Arendt makes a lot of in her work, especially in On Revolution. And even, our soul, which someone might think is invisible, when our soul, however, is visible, she says, because if you get embarrassed in your soul, you redden, or if you get anger, you might have, steam coming from your ears, or you redden. And so there's ways in which our passions, which impact our soul, are visible. But in thinking and judging, the whole point is to be disinterested, to be separate. And the life of the mind, she says, is sheer activity. And I'm by myself, with myself, with no one else. So in this thinking, I withdraw from the world to the world of imagination, to what is, and so I make what is absent present. I make what is the past, I bring it back and present it in my memory. I make what doesn't exist, but is only metaphorical and is therefore absent present in my mind. And in doing so, I speak to myself. I occupy myself with myself, and this is what she calls solitude. We'll read a lot more about solitude, but solitude is for Arendt the condition of thinking, and thus it differs from loneliness. Whereas loneliness is when I'm deprived of all human company, including myself. Loneliness is a feeling of being utterly abandoned by the world, including myself. Solitude is when I'm actually engaged with myself in the act of thinking. So on the one hand, thinking the mental activities are invisible. Potentially, I think even more important in her articulation of these mental activities is that they embody a decisive and withdrawal from the world, right? So this chapter is called Invisibility and Withdrawal. And it's not just that they're invisible. She says there on page 75, she says they involve a deliberate, on the bottom of the page, a deliberate withdrawal from appearances. It is a withdrawal not so much from the world as from the world's being present to the senses. What is that? A withdrawal from the world's being present to the senses. So you might think that in thinking, senses matter. And yes, to some degree they do. But we withdraw from even the senses. So every mental act rests on the mind's faculty of having present to itself what is absent from the senses. This is an extraordinary activity and claim on her part, that in thinking and in judging, we actually fully divorce ourselves from the sense world, from the apparent world. So that judgment, she says, presupposes, on page 78, judgment, she says, presupposes an unnatural and deliberate withdrawal from involvement and the partiality of immediate interests. You can't judge if you're engaged in the world. Similarly, thinking, you have to divorce yourself, fully withdraw yourself from the sensible world. And she says that the only person and the best person who understood this is Augustine, someone that Arendt is always in conversation with in her work. And this passage on Augustine from page 77 to 78 is worth really attending to. In this withdrawal, which she's describing, and this is, I think, this is what I call the third part of this section, section 9. In this withdrawal, the mind, the thinking ego, prepares particulars for will and judgments. We take the world, the senses, the particulars, the actions, and we cut them off from the world, and we transport them from the world into the mind. So you all know the idea of metaphor is a carrying over, a metaphorane. It's to carry beyond or carry over. And what thinking as a metaphorical activity does is carry over things from the sensible world to the mental world. And this is, and the radicalness of Arendt's thinking here comes from her repeated use of the word desensing. Desensing. So that what she's saying is that in the withdrawal from particulars, we desense them. We desense the world. And so she says, again, building on Augustine, that here's the steps of the argument, and I'm going to just lay it out. There's a sensible body, right? My book, that's a sensible body that I can see and you can see, I hope. And then there's the vision I have formed by the interaction of my eyes and my body and my mind with the sensible body. And that's the That's the imagination, the imaging. But then there's another vision. There's a vision within my head, my brain, whatever, my mind, whatever we want to call it, in which I take the image and I represent it to myself. And I cut it off from the sensible image and make it a new mental image stored in my memory. And then I take this mental image, which is already cut off from the sensible image, which is already cut off from the sensible body, and I think it. And in thinking it, I get hold of it with my mind, and I can make of it what I will. That's the power of thinking. And so what remains at the end, in the thinking image, in the thinking thought, is nothing that was sensible. It's desensed. And so she says on 77, hence the thought object is different from the image. The thought object is different from the image. And also the image is different from the sense object. And then she says on 77 again, this twofold transformation, right? On the one hand, the cutting from the image to the representation, and then from the representation to the thought thing. This twofold transportation means that thinking, in fact, goes even further beyond the realm of all possible imagination. Thinking goes beyond what we think, has nothing to do with even what we can imagine. It goes beyond that. And when our reason proclaims the infinity of number, there's no vision in the thought of corporeal things that we can grasp. And so we can separate ourselves from the thought things. And thus, that's what she means by thinking demands a withdrawal from the world, a complete dissensing from the world. And that's why thinking is so unnatural, why it's so out of order, as she's going to say on 78 and 79. And this is the transition to section 10, the next section we read for today, on the intramural warfare between thought and common sense, insofar as the thinker is so occupied with this invisible withdrawal into a world separate from sensible reality that they lose common sense, or they, that may be too strongly put, they can be separated from common sense. Common sense in this, again, common sense is that sixth sense, which unites the five senses and brings them together and fits us into a shared world, an apparent world, a world we share, with others. What is that common world? And so what she says is all philosophers are engaged in an intramural fight or warfare between thought and common sense. On the one hand, as people, human beings, we live in an apparent world, and we have bodies and we have senses and we see the world. On the other hand, as philosophers, to the extent one is a philosopher, one desenses oneself, one retreats into this invisible withdrawal. And we lose that fit with the common world. And so on the one hand, we're a man in the world. On the other hand, we're outside the world, she's going to say. And it's this, with this warfare, this constant struggle that she's going to explore here in section 10. She has a number of examples that she's going to bring to bear. Plato's fear of the many, and his fear that the many will kill the philosopher if they return from the light of the sun back into the cave. And what she says about that is, actually, the many rarely kill philosophers. They don't find them that interesting. It's more the philosophers who fear the many, and people like Socrates, and often will, in some sense, try and limit them or abuse them. What the philosophers really care about and are worried about is being laughed at. And she uses the example of the Thracian maid who laughs at Thales, the Greek thinker who looks up at the stars, and as he's walking, falls into the well. And it's that laughter that in many ways the philosophers fear. She also talks, I think, of the beautiful story of Orpheus and Eurydice, when Orpheus at the very end, he goes into the underworld to bring back Eurydice. At the last moment, having been told he can't, if he looks back, he'll lose her. He looks back and she disappears. And this is her understanding of what happens when the philosopher tries to re-enter the world of reality. Their thought ideas, the invisibles, vanish again immediately. Thinking annihilates the real, and the real will chase thinking away. And so the philosopher and all thinkers are caught in this intramural war between, on the one hand, a desensitized withdrawal thinking, and on the other hand, the common sense reality. The philosopher that more than any other embodies this intramural war for Arendt is Hegel. I don't know how many of you read Hegel or have read Hegel, but the fundamental drive of Hegelian philosophy is the dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so you always have a general, a particular, and then a synthesis where the general and the particular are resynthesized into a new general. And what this is a constant attempt to take all particulars and suck them up into a thought system, into a overall system of thought. And it's basically a constant effort to turn the real into the ideal, turn the world into a thought world. I mean, Hegel is the philosopher par excellence who believes that the entire real world is actually the manifestation of thinking, and that we have to constantly make it rational, and that the real is rational. We just have to understand it, and then we have succeeded in doing it. And so it's an attack on the real in many ways. For Hegel, the goal of philosophy is Versöhnung, reconciliation, the reconciliation of Geist, the ideal, and the real. And Arendt, as some of you know, this is something I work a lot on in Arendt. Arendt is constantly is obsessed and intrigued by this idea of reconciliation with the world, which is another way of saying making the world our own, making the world our thought, which is another way of saying of loving the world, or amor mundi. The whole thought of amor mundi is as a meditation on Hegelian reconciliation, on the idea of how we reconcile ourselves and make the world, which is particular and evil and horrific and genocides and racism and anti-Semitism and all these things, and somehow make it rational and ideal. It's a theodicy. And Arendt's answer to that in some degree is, on the one hand, we have to seek to love the world, but we have to give up on the Hegelian claim that we can rationally justify the world, that there is a rational reconciliation. And so we have to come, in her articulation in the human condition, to love the world in its irreconcilability, to reconcile with an irreconcilably broken world where tradition has been broken and we lose that thread of tradition. And that's in many ways her response to the Hegelian project of reconciliation. And so unlike Hegel, who thinks that we have to eliminate the particular, suck it up into the real, for Arendt, we have to sit in this warfare between the ideal and the real. And if you've read the prologue to her book, Between Past and Future, you know that thinking for Arendt is to sit in this battlefield between past and future, between the effort to reconcile and the futility of reconciliation, and to struggle and think through what it means to live without banisters, what it means to live in a world where tradition has been broken. And this is very much the space, this battlefield of her idea of thinking. All right, I'll stop there as a reading of these two sections. Just so you know that we'll read 11 through 14 for next week. Those are some of the richest sections, I think, in the book, and we'll have a chance to really dig deeply into these questions of what it means to think the invisible and withdraw through metaphor and language. But I'll stop there for now and open it up to questions. As you know, there's you can ask questions in the chat or have a discussion in the chat. I don't always get to those, but you guys can talk to each other. There's some really knowledgeable people on here. And I will call on people in the order that you raise your hands, which you can do by going down to the reactions tab at the bottom of your page, clicking on it, and click on raise hand. Very intuitive, I hope. All right. It's great to have you back. It's nice to be here with you, and let's open the Q&A. And it seems that we are starting with Hal.
Yeah, no, I do. I enjoyed this chapter. I'm not sure if you got. I did actually send you an email this past week. I wasn't sure if you got that at all, but it's something I'm really trying to find the answer to. It's just a question of the human condition. But related to this book, just so far, of course, Arendt seems to be discussing the philosophers like separate, of course, from just the average person in a way that like is almost like you'd think of it more of as an occupation. But obviously at the time you had in ancient Greece, you had, and maybe this is just a point of history or a question, but you obviously had the famous philosophers, and then you had like the sophists. But what role is she actually going to mention or really consider like the average person thinking? I mean, she's writing this book in response to Eichmann in Jerusalem, and Eichmann, of course, wasn't expected to or shouldn't be expected to a certain extent be like a philosopher. So like, at what point is this just a ridiculously neat, I guess the question is like, at what point is this almost like a niche concern? Because even the sophists like Socrates didn't respect those as philosophers, and that was as close to like, I guess, the generic public intellectuals in ancient Greece as you get to today.
Thanks, Hal. First, resend the email to me. I think I missed it, but I'll look for it. It's a good question. As she says at the beginning of this book, this is the first book she writes that she thinks is a book of philosophy. She says she's not a philosopher. And yet she calls this a book of philosophy. And you're saying, well, I mean, why is she writing a book of philosophy? And is it for philosophers or is it for everyday people? And if one of the reasons she says she's writing it, one of the reasons is simply a philosophical reason to look at the place of contemplation as a sequel to the human condition. But if another is to think about the question of whether thinking can, in some way, be a barrier to evil, don't we need to make it more accessible to everyday people? And I think that's a fair point. There's a few things to say. One is, at least in this part of the book, right, she's still interested in simply what thinking is. And to that extent, she's largely going to explore it through the activities of those who excel at it, if I can use that term. Professional thinkers is one way to put it, but clearly not all professional thinkers. She's looking at the people she thinks are the best thinkers. will it and can that have an impact on the world? So in the sections we read today, I think it was in section, I believe it was in section 9. She says that these thinking can have an impact on the world. And statistically, it's on page 71. Statistically, she says, which is a weird, interesting phrase for her, the most powerful impact that thinking has in the world is when it's absent, right? Because for most people, most of the time, we don't think. So on 71 in the middle of the page, she'll say, absence of thought is indeed a powerful factor in human affairs. Statistically speaking, the most powerful, not just in the conduct of the many, but in the conduct of all, right? Not just the many, but all of us, even the philosophers. The very urgency, the ascolia, and scholia is a kind of leisure to think. That's where our word school comes from. So what a school is a time to separate yourself, to withdraw yourself from the concerns of the world so you can have time to think. And ascolia is being involved in the world and therefore not being able to think. So the very urgency, the ascolia of human affairs demands provisional judgments or prejudices. All of us, philosophers and not, none of us can think all the time. We just would go crazy. We can't. We have to largely live our lives according to conformities and prejudices and all of that. And yet this is the way in which the world, that thinking impacts the world the most, is in its lack of thinking. So I think Hal's asking the opposite question. Well, when does thinking impact the world the most? And she will answer that later in the book. She'll also talk a lot about it in certain other essays or things, one of which, probably the best of which, is in her essay or short fragment, Thinking and Moral Considerations, where she says that for the most part, thinking doesn't impact the world. But when it does so because the thinker stops and thinks and stands apart. And as everybody else goes along unthinkingly doing what they're doing, the thinker, by their hesitation and by their refusal and their standing apart, is like a wrench in the works and makes people at least stop and think, makes them think, should I also be holding back and not engaging? And so the main way thinking impacts the world and can prevent evil, Hal, is not by teaching people or having people think and coming up with the right answers or anything like that. It's by providing examples of people who hold themselves back from the world and think. And in doing so, that, she thinks, can inspire others to think as well and hold themselves back and make judgments for themselves. And so the power of thinking is the power of example, and that's the way that it can impact the world. She doesn't think, and this is, I think, important for Hal's question, she doesn't think that only professional thinkers can think. In fact, if you read Eichmann in Jerusalem, just to take one example, many of the people she highlights as the most thoughtful people, the people whose actions actually made a difference, were not intellectuals. And what she says in that book is the intellectuals, for the most part, rationalized going along with the Nazis. The intellectuals largely didn't hold themselves back. It was, common everyday people who were religious or who simply couldn't bring themselves to do what they were told to do, who were conscientious objectors. And they don't have to be philosophers. They're just thinkers. And so, that's where thinking can lead to action in the world. Okay, Greg.
Yeah, hi. I have two quick questions, I think. One is on page 74, when she talks about this loneliness and solitude issue, which is important for her. She mentions that loneliness she describes as being deserted by the company of oneself. And I don't quite understand how that happens. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that. And then the second question was, in different places, if I'm not mistaken, she says things like, we think in generalities. What does that mean? I don't quite get that one either. I wonder if you could share your views on that.
Yeah. So when she says that loneliness is being deserted by the company of oneself, what she means is that okay, so solitude is when you're by yourself, but with yourself. So whether you're walking in the woods or whether you're smoking your cigarette on the porch, you're in a conversation with yourself. And thus you're engaged and you're not lonely. Loneliness is when you're either by yourself in the woods or at a party or in a class or on the porch or wherever. And you don't talk to yourself. You're just, the word that I want to say, but I also want to protect myself from saying it, is bored. Boredom, which Heidegger offers an entire course on around the time that Arendt is there. Boredom can be a state in which one, through boredom, separates oneself from the boring real world and enters into a conversation with oneself. But boredom can also be simply an oppressive feeling of the utter weight and meaninglessness of the world, where one sits there like a log and does nothing. The denied the company of myself is when you feel you're alone or not alone or wherever you are, but you feel so deserted. You feel so abandoned. The world is so meaningless that you simply don't think. You don't engage in the conversation because what's the point? So the argument underlying, Arendt's thinking about loneliness and which is at the core of a lot of her thought. She wants to make the argument that traditionally, lonely people were people on the margins of society, people who were, radically excluded from the social world, or very old, people who were basically dying or things like that. And there's just like, what's the point? And they just want to die. They don't want to engage in the world anymore. What her argument in the last epilogue added chapter of the Origins is that this sort of fringe experience of loneliness has become ever more central to the experience of life in the modern world, for a number of reasons. One is, factory work and sort of just the slog of the work life. But more importantly are two others. One being the loss of religion and tradition and family, and those meaningful traditions and ideals that fit us and make the world have a purpose. Christianity, for all you want to criticize it, if you do, at least gave people who felt that the world was harsh and evil, a belief that there was a purpose for it. And Nietzsche famously says, man can endure all pain as long as he believes that his life has a purpose. Loneliness is the feeling that there's just no purpose, so why bother? And then you're deserted by even the desire to keep yourself company and have a conversation with yourself. The other modern development that leads to loneliness, besides this sort of purposelessness, is the rise of sort of logic and pseudoscience, and the belief that there's sort of a logical frame to the world. And it's that logicality, the circle of logicality, that again makes it seem like we're caught and there's no way out, and that therefore there's no meaning to think about the unknowable, that the whole world is explainable in a logical system. And so those are the two. I hope that gives you a sense of the kind of complete abandonment and purposelessness and hopelessness that she associates with loneliness and its distinction from solitude.
Roger, could I possibly say something that in there about loneliness? It's into. I'll take my headphones out. It's because Melanie Klein wrote in her last paper, it was on loneliness, and it's rather expressive, poetic paper, but what she is leaning on is an idea very close to what you're talking about, but also different. And that is, from a psychoanalytic point of view, in a certain sense, you're never alone. You're alone with something. So when the sense of abandonment is dominant, that's a kind of depression. I don't mean depressive illness. I mean a kind of existential depression that's part of all of us. But that depression has a content, as if you're alone with a feeling, like with your superego, that you're worthless, that life is meaningless, there's no goodness left in the world. Whereas when you're alone in the other sense, you're not abandoned, because internally you're supported by beliefs in yourself, beliefs that may have very deep roots, like the capacity to feel some self-esteem, some love for yourself, or to feel you can be loved. Ultimately, this goes back, of course, to the earliest relationships that endow us with the feelings of being loved by a mother. And it's when you lose that you're abandoned to these negative perceptions of yourself and fall into this terrible state. But of course, this can be supported or not by the external experience. So if the external world confirms an experience of worthlessness and superfluity, then of course you're very much more at the mercy of these internal figures who that express that. When the world confirms a feeling of belonging and being loved and in the world with others, then you're somewhat protected. But there is what I'm saying, there's a less conscious internality which this leans on. At least that's, I'm trying to avoid, one's an appearance and one's a reality, because I agree that's a rather false way of looking at it. But I'm just saying there's another dimension to it. If one thinks of Jesus, for example, the final terrible words on the cross, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" It's a feeling of being abandoned by the loving object.
I think that's right. That's very, I don't know the Melanie Klein article, David, but I appreciate the reference. I think you're right on. I mean, and Arendt's not presenting it purely in a psychological way, but I think there is a psychological element to what she's saying. And, her point is that this abandonment is very much at the center of modern life. And it's what leads people to feel adrift and alone. And it leads them then to need a purpose that they don't feel they have, and need the love that maybe they don't get from their primary relationships. And that's what, in a sense, prepares the ground for pseudoscientific totalitarian movements. And so thinking as the experience not of loneliness, but of solitude, almost the opposite, the feeling of seeking and searching for purpose and meaningfulness, not truth, right? Is the antidote to loneliness and the preparation for totalitarianism. And that's why Arendt raises the question of whether thinking can be the thing that, the activity that, in a sense, could prevent, or at least in some ways hinder, the rise of evil in the modern world. Greg, I know you had a second question, and I have to admit I forgot what it was.
Oh, it was just, why does she say we think in generalities? I just didn't get that part, but we can move on though if other people have questions too.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a, I'll just, that's a simple answer. I mean, thinking for her, as I said, is a desensitized process. So it's not about particulars. It's about rules. She says at the very beginning of chapter 9, thinking is autonomous. All mental activities are autonomous. They follow rules or laws. So if you're a thinker, as if you're a Hegelian, you think in theses. There's an antithesis, you subsume it, you create a new thesis. And so it's always taking the specific or the particular and turning it into a general, and desensitizing it from the world. If that helps. Susan.
So I always am trying to deal with the different terms that she uses. She brings up the word consciousness and imagination, and somewhere in instinct, or intuition, I think. I can't find that one, but the one that really troubles me is her appearing to equate the soul with passions and feelings. Page 72, second paragraph. The soul, where our passions, our feelings, and emotion arise, is more or less chaotic welter of happenings, which we do not enact but suffer. And she connects it to the body. And I am definitely not a theologian or scholar of that, but I would be interested to hear other people talk about that. It seemed to be very much a diminution of the concept of soul that I guess I am used to.
I'm sure there are probably people who agree with you on that. And I, what does she mean by the soul here? I have no idea. I mean, it's just, I know what she's saying. It's the soul, she says. I mean, I guess think about it, the difference between heart and mind, if you want to put it in that terms. Mind is, as Greg just said, abstract, general, desensed. But the heart, the soul, this is an argument that the soul is sort of more in the heart than in the mind, is where we feel. Whereas the mind is sheer activity, the soul is pathetic, pathos. It's a feeling. I don't know. I don't think anything's at stake in the naming that soul. I think she's just working within a particular tradition where the soul is more in the heart than in the mind. But I don't have much. I think it's here not because she has a deep need to explain or have a theory of the soul, but more to demarcate what she means by thinking in the mind. Now, I think the critique of this demarcation is to raise questions about, well, can we separate the two? So someone like Heidegger in Being in Time will argue that there's always a sort of sensible feeling associated with thinking, and that all thoughts have a thinking aspect to them. I think it's weird because I think in some other places in her work, I think Arendt is close to agreeing with that. And yet here in this book, she's really, and we've talked a lot about this in this group over the years. She's a thinker of distinctions and etc. And she's here making a distinction between that part of our mental state that is thinking and that part that is feeling or passionate. And she doesn't really ask the question of, can these truly be separated? Although she clearly is separating. I mean, she's doing it to sort of support her overarching argument about how extraordinary and excessively out of order and desensed thinking is. But I think there's a legitimate counter to this claim of hers, that there is no radically desensed thinking, and that all thinking carries with it a kind of feeling. I mean, Kant himself will offer an account and say that the feeling associated with thinking is what he calls the transcendental feeling of finding myself to be rational. Now that, I think Arendt would say, is a non-passionate, but Kant calls it a non-empirical feeling, and thus a desensed feeling. And so I think in some ways Arendt is offering a Kantian approach to thinking here, which could be seen as very different from a Heideggerian one, where thinking is more connected to feelings and passions. Is that okay, Joe?
Yeah, hi. I've got a question which relates to part of the text on page 85, where she's talking about imagination and the desensing of objects. So it reads, in order to appear to my mind only, it must first be desensed, and the capacity to transform sense objects into images is called imagination. So I'm just a little bit confused, I suppose, about the temporal nature of this, and also whether this is relating to perception or to the reflective act of thinking and how imagination acts into that.
Great. Thanks, Joe. I think that's a good question, and it addresses a certain ambiguity, and I think a mistake that a lot of people who read philosophy make. So when Kant uses the word imagination, he uses it in a very strict philosophical sense, as Arendt defines it here, which is the capacity to transform sense objects into images. It's an imaging, it's an imagination. It takes, my book, and I imagine it, and then I can put the book away, and I cannot see the book. It's absent, and yet I can have an image of that book in my head. That's strictly imagination. Now, the ambiguity is that Arendt says that's not thinking. Thinking goes further in that it then takes that image that I have of the book where the book is absent, and I can play with that and put wings on it and have a flying book, and I can put it on the clouds, and I have a book on the clouds, and I can think about the meaningfulness of books, and I can think about, well, what is a world without books, or what are ebooks, and all these things, and I can start to manipulate my image, and that separates from the actual particular Hannah Arendt's life of the mind, right? That goes away. And I think for many people, especially those who are artists or artistically inclined today, they think that's what imagination is. That's that imaginary act. And sometimes imagination is used in that way. But and Arendt at times will even, I think, use it that way. But here, she's using it in more of a in a more strictly Kantian philosophical sense. And but I hope what you'll see is that there's, in a sense, two levels to imagination. Then there's the imagination in which we take the sense object, we make an image of it. Then there's the sense we take that image and we put it into our head. And then there's the sense where we take that image that's in our head and we think it and manipulate it. And I think that's the last way, which is what she calls thinking, is also called by many people imagination, because it's freed from the sensible. And I think at times later in the book, she will actually use imagination that way. But for now, that's not how she's using it.
May I
Does that answer
disagree?
your, yeah, yes, you can answer, but let me just, Joe, is that what you were asking about, or did I not get it?
Yeah, no, that was what I was asking about. I suppose I was also, I'm also a little uncertain about the first part of it, that there seems to be this temporal element to it, and that how perception, how we make sense of the sense data that we receive without thinking about it, yet we can identify or differentiate objects, and what's pre-reflective and what's reflective and thinking. It seems very complex. There seems like there's lots of potential parts to it.
Yeah, I don't want to get too complex. I mean, it's, I think she's just trying to say that there is a way in which you see something and you image it, right? And then you represent it and then you think it. She wants to emphasize the way in which thinking is already dealing with not the sense object, but a thought object. And thus it's freed from the world. It's based on a really radical withdrawal from the world. Someone else wanted to add to that? Who was that?
May I? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So my take of it was that you have the sense perception while you see or realize the object itself with your senses. It's at the same time, it's there and you are there. And then imagination is that it is taken away from, so there's no sense perception anymore. But when you talked about the flying book and all these imaginations, this is still akin to sense perception. And then the thought thing would be the concept or the idea of book. And this would also go to the direction of we think in generalities. So that's then abstract and so desensed that there are no things like imagining a cover and pages fluttering around with a flying book that you can imagine, but it's completely abstract, because and only then it's a thought object. So the imagination is, in German we have also the word Vorstellung, which is different from concept or Begriff.
That's right. I mean, and the imagination of the book with the wings, you then can think of an ebook, or then you can think of a book not with any form, but just an argument with words or even pictures. And then you can even think of books as simply sustained arguments, and you can, as you said, desense them in that way. And that's the kind of radical separation that she's talking about. I think that's right. Helpful. Okay, Benjamin.
Hi, yeah, so maybe this is too speculative to have any kind of like an answer behind it, but if we're talking about the sense world and how it interacts with thought, so we do want to say that thinking becomes desensed in that it becomes not reliant on things that exist in the world that we've seen, a flying book, book on the clouds, etc. But certainly it's also the case that in those instances we have, like, we're able to turn them into speech and talk about them with each other because they interact with appearances in some way, because we've seen flying things and we've seen books, etc. Like, would it be possible or appropriate, or would this like fit into her paradigm to say that the thinking process doesn't necessarily rely on appearances, but where there's not an appearance, it becomes sort of like unable to be spoken of because there's no transitory medium? Like I couldn't even understand it myself, maybe, if it was happening, because it doesn't relate to anything in the world that I've seen. Or does the thought process simply not happen if there isn't, grist for the mill, if there isn't some sense perception that feeds into it? Or again, is this, I'm not even 100% sure that these words make sense, but
yeah, no, this is what we're going to be talking about next week,
okay.
in the sense that what she's going to argue is that there is no thinking outside of language. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago in an earlier section, but we'll come back to it in the next few sections on language and metaphor. And the argument is that, all thinking, even the most abstract conceptual thinking that Patrick was just talking about, is still linguistic, because we can't have a concept without language.
Right.
And language is for her ultimately a kind of metaphorical, it is all based in metaphor. We don't have any words. Even the basic concept book, Patrick was saying, well, you can free it from the thing with a cover and whatever. And yet, can you? In what way can you? And Arendt's going to argue, you're always, when you talk about a book, even in its concept, you're always going to have some tie back to a sensible world. And that's one way in which thinking for her is going to continue to be, even in its withdrawal, we're caught up in language. And insofar as language is metaphorical and optical and pictorial, we are still, we never really leave the world of appearances. And so, if the first two sections that we read today are this sort of radical thesis of our exiting the world of appearance into this mental activity, the next few sections are actually going to invert that process and say, because our thinking is always linguistic and metaphorical, we're always still caught up in the world of appearances, and we never, even the most radical thinking never fully leaves it. And
so by desensed, then I guess she's just meaning sort of a decoupling from what we've like, we're not having to rely on literally our memory, or even like we're able to escape the bounds of what our model would tell us we might expect to see if we opened a door. Like, I never expect to see a flying book, but I can desense in my imagination like the idea of that and imagine it, but not desense it in the sense that it isn't always related to things that I've seen, and language, which presupposes the person I'm talking to and me is the language formulator. Okay.
Yeah.
I think, okay.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Who's next? William? Is that right?
Yeah. Hi, Roger.
Hi.
Thanks so much for your introduction. So I thought there were some really interesting discussions around the concept of loneliness in Hannah Arendt's broader thought. And there are a couple. There are a couple reflections I had on it that I sort of want to add to the conversation. So in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she thinks that one of the the characteristics of the masses is not only loneliness, but also a loss of common sense. That when we are unable to share intersubjective understandings of things together, then we become more susceptible to ideological explanations, pseudoscience, and sort of the manipulations that those things can have on our sense of reality. But at the same time, she sees one of the primary perpetrators of the Nazi regime and of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, as someone who suffers not from a lack of common sense, but from a lack of thought or thinking. You pointed, when you're answering Hal's question, you pointed to the idea that this may be because he was unable to make judgments for himself, and that thinking is a necessary prerequisite to begin to make those sort of judgments. But I think, given her reflections around common sense and the place it played in totalitarianism and that time period, I think she equally could have gone in the direction that Eichmann had a deficiency of common sense, or was separated from a worldly reality through a lack of common sense, and was lonely or something as well. So I'm curious to ask you, how do you understand, how would Arendt see common sense as fitting into judgment? Is there some sort of necessary prerequisite of common sense before we can make a judgment, as there is thinking is a prerequisite before judgment? And if there is some sort of prerequisite of common sense before judgment, how do we make sense of that, given that there is this conflict, this intramural warfare between thought and common sense? So that's my question.
Thanks, William. Maybe I can, before I answer the full question, ask you why you think Eichmann has common sense.
I don't think he has common sense. I think that Arendt would have seen him as someone as deficient of common sense.
Oh, I took you to be saying the opposite. Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay. So then I'm a little confused as to your question, but you're basically asking about relation in common sense and judgment.
That was the main question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just trying to give you a sense of how I arrived at that particular question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll get more, into that in the postscript to thinking when she talks a bit about judgment. And obviously, if we decide after reading Thinking and Willing, if we decide to read a couple of the essays in which she talks about judgment afterwards, we can come back to that. But for Arendt, there's a few things we can say about judgments. One, the go-kart of judgments, the way you do it is through examples of judgment. You can't teach people, you have to exemplify them. And you can't teach judgment. There are no rules for the application of rules. In a sense, people have to just know it, and they can be made aware of it through seeing other people make judgments. And if they see other people make judgments and say, oh, that's right, I agree, then they not only affirm that judgment, but they are in a sense help to nurture their own innate sense of judgment. There's a famous footnote in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals by Kant, in which he talks about a letter he has from a Professor Sulzer, who asks, how you can teach people moral judgment. And Kant says, unfortunately, it took me too long to figure it out, and Sulzer's died, and I can't answer him anymore. But the answer is through examples. And Arendt makes a lot of this in her lectures on Kant, in thinking about judgment. So that when one makes a judgment, so take, for example, a judgment Hannah Arendt once made. Her judgment that the proper response by the judges in the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem would be to have said, you didn't violate any laws, but you deserve to be killed. She thinks the judges made a mistake in trying to argue that Eichmann is guilty because he violated laws, and the law that he violated was the law against aiding and abetting murder, according to the Israeli judges. And she thinks that's ridiculous. What he did was much worse than that. And so she says there was no law against what he did, but what he did was so wrong, it deserves that he should be wiped off the face of the earth. And so the end of the book, she ventriloquizes what she thinks the judgment of the judges should have been, which is that you should be wiped off the face of the earth. I take that to be a judgment in which she would hope that people reading or seeing, if she were the actual judge, that kind of judgment would say, I agree. And in saying I agree, they would affirm that they live in a common world with her in which that judgment is just and true. And so all judgment is a woo. She calls it a wooing, a seducing. All judgment is a sense, here's what I think we all share in our commonness. And you judge and you make a gamble that other people will say, yes, I agree with you, and share your judgment. And in doing so, you'll remake the world. You'll recondition the world that then will condition us, because they'll create a new agreement on certain foundational ideas. Now, when you make a judgment and people say, no, I disagree with you, then you see a contest or a break in the common world. And the question then is, how can we find, where can we find where we agree and what's common? But judgment both depends upon, but also is a creating of or a wooing to the common world and what we share in common. Okay.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yep. Hi, Jen.
Hello. Hi, thanks. This has been a really fascinating session so far. So my question is about the role of remembering, because it starts out this section saying, thinking, willing, judging are the three basic mental activities that cannot be derived from each other and are essentially discrete. And I sort of initially wondered, where is remembering in this? And then on page 78, she gives us some hint that thinking and remembering for her are related. She says, thinking always implies remembrance. Every thought is strictly speaking an afterthought. And then there's a little bit more along these lines on page 85 into 86 about the temporality of thinking, where she says at the bottom of 85, thinking annihilates temporal as well as spatial distances. I can anticipate the future, think of it as though it were already present, and I can remember the past as though it had not disappeared. And then on to the next page, where she talks about Oedipus or Orpheus and Eurydice. And she says that it's fitting that the myth should relate to remembrance and not to anticipation. The faculty of anticipating the future in thought derives from the faculty of remembering the past, which in turn derives from the even more elementary ability to de-sense and have present before and not just in your mind what is physically absent. And so thinking through these different moments in her text, it seemed to me that remembering is tied into her sort of concept of thinking. And she talks on 87 as well about how by repeating a simple telling of what has happened, whether the story then tells as it is or it fails to do so, is preceded by the desensing operation. So the sort of removed from the sensory world is tied into this idea of remembering the past. But at the same time, there's a little bit of confusion for me because I think sometimes of remembering as a very sensorily driven activity. Senses in the world can provoke memory, and memory can bring you back to the experience of a certain sensation in your body. And so I just wondered, in your reading and others in the group, if they want to add in the chat, this sort of where remembering fits in and how remembering relates to being sensory or desensed in this way.
Thanks, Jen. That's a great question. Just yesterday, I was out at the Parliament of Reality at Bard College, which is a sculptural installation by Olafur Eliasson. And it's an extraordinary space if anyone is ever in the Bard area, and I highly recommend you to see it. It's my favorite place on campus. And I was working with an artist who's making a performance piece that will be performed at our conference coming up October 14th to 15th. It will be a mix of dance and music. But what she was doing yesterday was we were dancing around the Parliament of Reality, but moving, and she was moving our bodies and asking me questions and trying to use the movement process to evoke memories and thought. And it's a very powerful experience if one has done something like this. I mean, she's trained in this. This is what she does. So when you were speaking, Jen, I immediately had this memory of some of the, emotions that we were doing yesterday. And so I think you're absolutely right, that there's a profound bodily somatic connection. I've studied for many years something called Feldenkrais, which is a awareness through movement, mind, body exercise. I've done it for over 35 years. And, I am deeply aware of that. And I think that there's in some way in this Kantian philosophical approach that Arendt is here doing. I think I alluded this to it earlier, suggested earlier, something that I think is missing. She will, as I said, in the next few chapters, in a sense, walk this back a little bit and reconnect us to the world. Although she'll do it, again, through metaphor and more of a memory that is not somatic, I think. Maybe, I think there could be an interesting attempt to read a kind of muscle memory or somatic memory, motion memory into her ideas of metaphor and language. And I think that would be a worthwhile project for someone to look into. But I take your point, Jen. Yeah, I take your point. I saw Vivian had a hand up, but I think I don't know if she's left.
No, hi. No, I'm here. I could, if there's time, I could say what I wanted to say. It was in response to Ben, though. I think it was Ben who was talking about common sense and judgment again. Remember, I asked you about that last time and everything. I was just, I can't help but sort of make associations, but I think in a way we're talking about that. I think the text addresses that with reality and thinking and our experience of it. I was thinking that about probably not even 10 years after Arendt's Eichmann book was published, the great German-French filmmaker Max Ophüls made the iconic The Sorrow and the Pity, Le Chagrin et la Pitié. And which I don't know how many of this group have seen that 5-hour movie or 4-hour movie, whatever it is. I've known the script to the film since before I was 18 years old. I must have been about 17. My dad bought me the paperback of the script. It was a few years afterwards that I was able to actually see the film. The film, I won't go into in detail, but it looks at how people behave under extreme circumstances, and whether or not, to me, the question, the film is really largely about the question of and we've touched on this now, can morality be taught? Or is it something, and you've said more than once in this session that it's by way of example. I think that the film would bear that out. To what extent does formal education address issues of morality that sometimes when they're played out in social situations and political situations seem like they're innate? And the film very clearly demonstrates it had absolutely nothing to do with objective position in society or a level of formal education. Some people under the gun will behave really beautifully, and most people will probably behave really badly. And so I just wanted to say that coming back to the judgment and the common sense, it seems, they're linked, they're different, but they're also linked and also different sides of perhaps the same thing. But that obviously, when thinking about Eichmann in the way that Arendt describes the character, the personality, and the condition of a human being like Adolf Eichmann, you understand that he was deeply, deeply an unsocialized being, and that the lack of common sense, because you explained when I last asked you about common sense, of how, what it means to Hannah Arendt, we are common social beings. He had absolutely no level of social skill whatever, either the kind of skill we think of as being sociable or being able to mix with other people, or anything deeper. It was absolutely devoid of that. And that was, in a way, the most striking thing about him. She didn't quite say it like that. I mean, she spoke about his inability to think, but it's linked to that issue of judgment. Then the other thing is, when you said, what she wrote at the end, how she delivers at the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, her judgment. It might be useful for other people here who haven't read it to say what she says, why she makes the judgment that she makes, because it's not because of what he did only, and that's what you said, that what he was legally accused of doing was kind of ridiculous in the face of what the actual events, the actual acts, but the fact that he decided that he and his ilk would not or could not share the world with other people, and therefore other people could not be expected to share obviously the social world with him. And that is how she, I think, explains how she comes to that judgment, because she also demonstrates, but doesn't go into perhaps, or maybe she does and I don't remember, she demonstrates how the idea of justice and the law often has nothing to do with morality. It really isn't about that. The law is the law. It varies in different places. The law is the law, and it doesn't have to do with our sense of what is right or what is wrong. I think that often in the face of painful and criminal acts, these things are probably often very confused. But I just wanted to bring the sorrow and the pity into it, because all of this, as I say, he definitely did that in the wake of Arendt. It was in the air. I mean, I've actually met him. He was no feminist. He was an old-fashioned, male. This little unattractive, very brilliant son of a very brilliant filmmaker himself. But it was obviously he was obviously very familiar with her Eichmann text and everything. So.
Thank you, Vivian. Yeah, I don't know the movie, but I'll have to check it out. It sounds.
My God, do you not know The Sorrow and the Pity?
No, I mean I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it, so I have to see that.
Okay, pre-Shoah.
Yeah.
So okay.
We'll show it at the Arendt Center.
Yeah.
See if some people want to come by. Thank you very much. All right, we'll take one last question from Denny, and then we'll move on. Hi, Denny.
Hi, thank you. Hoping you can listen to me clearly.
Yes.
I have got a question because every time that I read Hannah Arendt, it's for me difficult to try to understand what's the difference between judgment and thinking. I'm not completely sure about it. So,
yeah,
and
you
the second is, do you think that there is a link between action and judgment? Because I don't understand completely. What can you hear?
Yeah, I hear you. You're asking one of the hardest questions in Arendtian thought. Yes.
Yeah.
Denny's asking, like, what's the connection between judgment and thinking? And this the sort of joke answer is, if only she'd written the third volume, right? We have the volume on thinking, we have the volume on willing, we don't have the volume on judging. As a result, it's almost a cottage industry of people who sit there and try and say what she would have said about judging. A few things that we can say, and again, we will talk more about this in the last session on thinking, where she talks about the 2 and 1, and then also the or the section on the 2 and 1, and then also the section on the prologue, where she sort of the postscript, where she talks about judgment. Judgment, as I said, and what Vivian and I were just talking about, the basic, I think, judgment is inspired by thinking, insofar as thinking separates us from the everyday world, and frees us from it, and allows us to think freely, beyond convention and beyond prejudice and beyond what everyone else does. What judgment does is it dives back in. It takes a particular situation and it judges it. And in making that judgment, not based on any rules, not based on convention, but based on free thought, it re-enters the world of appearance. And when Arendt makes her judgment of Eichmann, she announces it so people can hear it, or she writes it so people can read it. And in doing so, it makes a claim to have said something worth hearing, that people can either agree with or disagree with, and thus can it becomes political in the way that it can remake and reconstitute the world and our common sense and the conditional world. You know, judgment and thinking, I think, are very similar and very connected, in that, you know, judgment depends upon the kind of freedom and free separation and withdrawal of thinking. But then, in a sense, judgment, I think, is an attempt to then re-enter and take up a particular, judge it free from the world, but then put it back in the world in a way that makes a claim about what politics and justice are in the world. You know, like I said, this is what actually judgment is very very contested and complicated, and we'll have to speak more about it as we get closer, as we with a text in front of us, which we don't have on judgment, which we'll do later in the course. All right, we're sort of past time, but Suzanne, you want to say one quick question or comment? Suzanne Ouellette? Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I think this connects, Roger, with what you just said. It's a sentence from last time on page 49. She's describing art, and it's in parentheses. She says, art, therefore, which transforms sense objects into thought things, tears them, first of all, out of their context in order to derealize and thus prepare them for their new and different function. When I read that the first time, it struck me as she's showing us kind of how the artist thinks. You know, the artist pulls something out, right? Brings it into the studio. What you've just said, though, leads me to see this now as the artist not only thinking, but judging. And in that last step of going back into this world with a new object, the artist has engaged in both thinking and judging. That's, is that
yeah,
correct?
I mean, she describes art as action in that sense, because you act into the world. And I think it's an interesting question that you're making me think about to what extent she wants to think about judgment as action. And I think there's a way in which she does. I mean, although I think this is going to be somewhat controversial. I mean, not controversial, but I'm not sure, because for her, judgment is aesthetic. It's an aesthetic act in which you, like an artist, you separate yourself, you think, and then you act and put it back in the world. The difference being, obviously, that an artist acts by putting a thing into the world, a sculpture or painting or song or a poem, or whatever. I don't want to cut anyone out of artists. Whereas a judge or someone who makes a judgment doesn't put a thing back in. They put a judgment. Now, if the judgment is spoken, then it's an action. If the judgment is, in Arendt's terms, written and published, then it's an action. And so, yeah, and that's when I think judgment and art converge.
Can I simplify here? Sorry, just in a couple words. Sorry, I can't resist. Sorry to interrupt. There's no art without doing. So action, doing, there's thinking, there's judgment, there's this and that. But every artist of every kind knows it's art is doing, it's making, it's doing, making, even if it's making an idea, a text, whatever.
The question I'm asking, Vivian, and I think that's right, is there a judgment without doing? And it seems to me that Arendt wants to say there is in this text, but I'm not entirely sure, because she never finished it. I'm not entirely sure what that is.
I think she's saying it because I think she more or less says, and you paraphrased it earlier today in your introduction, this issue of mediation. There's no, but whether you're talking about visualizing things or thinking about something without words, although you have not used the word language, there is no memory without language, there's no words, there's no thinking about anything, there's no imaginings without words, without language, without sounds, whatever. And that's how our haptic visceral experience of reality is mediated. Yes, both ideas and non-idea at the same time.
Well, and related maybe to the idea of thought that she had before as being, something which does take place in a desensed kind of a way. Like judgment in that way is having, like, weighting one kind of a desensed thought over another, or preferring one to another, which doesn't necessarily have to take place then in action, but presumably would in the future, because future input that you put in, you would abstract in a particular way based on your judgment of how the world is, for instance, or something like that. I don't know, just an idea.
But still the question is open, I think so. I mean, it's not clear if one can judge without acting in terms of Hannah Arendt. I think the question is open, Professor.
I agree with you. I think there's I think you'd have to have a pretty surreal idea of judgment that doesn't include, this comes back to the bodily embodied idea of thinking too, but judgment in some way, I think, has to be not simply withdrawn, but when you judge, I mean, I guess you can have an abstract intellectual judgment, but at some point you have to make the decision, and that decision is visible to others, I think. And again, I do think that's where Arendt stands, although that does raise the question of to what extent judgment is itself based in a withdrawal from the world.
May I? Because I think it's clearly written in the beginning of this chapter, when she says judgment, finally, the mysterious endowment of the mind by which the general, the concept, the idea, the thought thing, always a mental construction, and the particular, a thing, something in the real world, always given to sense experience, are brought together. So that's how it links.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt.
I think it's quite clear how it is described here.
Well, I think it's clear, but that says it's a peculiar faculty and in no way inherent in the intellect. So it's not in the intellect, because no rule is available for the applications of rules. Great. But if that's the case, how is judgment not, I mean, to bring up Suzanne's point, how is judgment different from an aesthetic judgment or an artist who makes a judgment? I mean, can you do a judgment without making a judgment? And I don't think you can. At least I don't know how you can.
Again, this question of activity, there's the worldly activity, and the other one is the mental activity. And all mental activities, it's one of the activities. So you can only by being active, an active.
I hear what
mentally.
you're saying. I'm just saying I don't understand what a judgment activity is that remains withdrawn from the world. I mean, it would have to be a purely mental judgment.
But that's what we're saying, right? Like, if it doesn't change and it's something which has actually happened, then the only thing that it can change would be that inner space, I suppose, the place into which you withdraw where thought happens, which is desensed, takes place apart from the world, but yet apparently has, certain proclivities in one direction or another, that you can maybe change that inner space of yours in a way which doesn't at the time need to be, like, doesn't need to appear to anyone, but you can, presumably it will in the future, as I say, like as you act with future input that you get, the impact of that judgment on your inner being will become evident because you'll behave in one way or another. But the moment of judgment doesn't, unless I'm thinking about this wrong, like doesn't need to affect the world because it affects the part of you that isn't in the world, the desensed part.
Mhm.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there and say, to me, this is something that is still, I'm not confident I have I've read more accounts of Arendt's theory of judgment than I care to admit. And I'm not sure I have a sense of what she thinks on this matter. So I'll have to leave it there. But it's good to leave us with some uncertainties and ineffabilities, and maybe that's a good spur to thinking. For next week, we'll finish chapter 2 of the thinking section. So sections 11, 12, and 13. Really wonderful sections. So I look forward to talking to you about them next week, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks all very much.